This is Heliox, where evidence meets empathy. Independent, moderated, timely, deep, gentle, clinical, global, and community conversations about things that matter. Breathe easy. We go deep and lightly surface the big ideas. We've all heard the golden rule of fighting climate change, right? I mean, it is practically carved into our collective consciousness at this point.
Oh, absolutely. The whole, if you want to save the planet, you plant a tree.
Exactly. And the logic seems, well, bulletproof on the surface. You picture this young, bright, green sapling shooting up from the dirt, rapidly sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere to, build its trunk and its leaves.
Right, because fast growth means fast carbon capture. That's the assumption.
Yeah, that's the core assumption. But what if the complex mathematical models that govern global forestry have the equation completely backwards?
Which is a terrifying thought when you realize how much policy relies on those models.
Totally. What if, in our rush to plant these highly managed, fast-growing forests of tomorrow, we are actually mathematically justifying the destruction of our absolute greatest climate assets today?
Well, we're looking at a classic case of humans engineering a system that completely misunderstands the biological machinery of the natural world.
And that's exactly what we're tackling today. Welcome to the deep dive. The premise we are unpacking in this one is going to, I think, fundamentally challenge how you look at a landscape.
Yeah, we are exploring the hard data showing that old-growth forests store vastly more carbon than managed replanted forests.
Yeah.
And yet, and this is the kicker, our government policies actively incentivize cutting them down.
It's wild. So to get to the bottom of this, we are pulling from a massive stack of research for you today.
A really heavy stack, yeah.
Oh, massive. We're going to dig into an advanced mathematical modeling thesis out of the University of British Columbia by researcher Young-Kun Yan.
We're also scrutinizing the British Columbia government's own timber supply review documents.
Right, and we are looking at this groundbreaking study from Lund University over in Sweden. Plus, we'll be breaking down national policy report cards from CPAWS, which is the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society.
So our mission today is really to travel from the deep, freezing soils of the Swedish boreal forest all the way to the ancient coastal rainforests of the Pacific Northwest.
Just to figure out where the math went wrong. Because somewhere, it went very wrong.
It did. The journey through this research reveals a massive systemic disconnect.
How so?
Well, we have the biological reality of how trees actually behave, right? And then we have the economic models that assume they act like factory widgets.
Well, factory widgets, wow.
Yeah, and that disconnect has immediate global ramifications, not just for the logging industry, but for our rapidly closing window to mitigate severe climate change.
I want to start right at the biological foundation of this, because I'll be honest, I was genuinely struggling with the fundamental premise when I first opened these files.
That's counterintuitive at first.
It really is. The foundational assumption of modern forestry is that young trees are the best way to capture carbon because their growth rate is visibly explosive.
You can literally watch them grow year by year.
Exactly. I have to admit, standing in a young plantation forest, it makes intuitive sense. You see all these saplings acting like ravenous teenagers.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. They are just devouring sunlight and CO2, fueling these massive, visible, upward growth spurts.
But then you contrast that with an old-growth forest.
Yeah, when you stand in front of a 500-year-old cedar, it looks completely static. It looks like a senior citizen who finished growing 3 centuries ago.
Just kind of hanging out.
Exactly. How can the static old tree be doing more work than the ravenous teenager?
So the confusion stems from conflating the rate of carbon sequestration with the overall volume of carbon storage.
Okay, unpack that for me. Rate versus volume.
The visual bias of human observation kind of tricks us. We see the young plantation shooting upward, adding vertical height quickly.
Right, the teenager sprouting up 6 inches in a summer.
Exactly. That is a high rate of intake relative to its tiny body size. But the adult bodybuilder, the ancient cedar in this analogy, even if they are eating at a slower, steadier pace to maintain their mass, actually contains vastly more physical substance.
But the research suggests the old trees aren't just maintaining mass, right? They are actively putting on more new muscle than the young trees.
Oh, absolutely. They never stop growing.
I read one statistic in our stack that literally stopped me in my tracks. It noted that a single massive ancient tree can capture as much carbon in just 1 year of its life as an entire medium-sized tree contains in its whole body.
It's staggering when you actually look at the number.
How is that even physically possible?
You have to think about the geometry of a giant tree. Carbon capture is a function of photosynthesis, right? Which requires surface area.
Okay, sure. Leaves and needles.
Right. A 500-year-old tree has a canopy the size of a city block. It contains millions of needles. It has an immense established root system pumping water and nutrients.
So it's a massive solar panel array.
Exactly. When that tree adds just a millimeter of new wood around its entire circumference, the outer ring of the trunk, plus every branch, plus every massive root, the sheer volume of that new wood is staggering.
Oh, wow. I never thought about the branches and the roots adding a millimeter, too.
Yeah, it's the whole organism. The teenager might grow 3 inches taller, but the bodybuilder just added a millimeter of dense muscle across a massive, massive frame.
So you are expanding the surface area of a cylinder that is already, 12 feet wide?
Precisely. And the data backs this up dramatically. In some of the old-growth forests they studied, the absolute largest trees make up a mere 6% of all the stems in the forest.
Just 6%.
Just 6%. Yet those giants account for an astonishing 33% of the forest's total yearly growth.
Wait, a third of the new growth comes from 6% of the trees?
Yes. They are not stagnant at all. They are highly sophisticated, multi-layered carbon warehouses that have been quietly accumulating capital in their biological bank accounts for centuries.
Okay, but if the giant trees hold so much mass, what is holding them up? This is where the story shifts from the canopy to the ground.
Right, you have to look down.
Because to truly grasp the scale of these carbon warehouses, the research forces us to look past the wood. We have to look at the dirt.
The soil is the hidden hero here.
I want to dive into this study out of Lund University in Sweden. Because Sweden is... they're a global powerhouse when it comes to forestry, right?
Oh, yeah, they have optimized timber extraction for decades.
Right. Operating under the assumption that their highly managed, regularly harvested woodlands were an excellent climate solution.
That was the prevailing wisdom.
But the Lund researchers decided to test that assumption by comparing managed woodlands directly against natural old-growth forests.
And they designed a very specific comparative methodology to do it.
Yeah.
They weren't just looking at the timber volume.
Which is what foresters usually measure, right?
Exactly. Normally, it's just about how many 2x4s you can get. But Lund was attempting to account for the carbon stored in the entire ecosystem.
And the disparity they uncovered was profound.
It really was. They found that old-growth natural forests in Sweden store 83% more carbon than managed woodlands.
83%.
Yeah, and when they isolated primary forests, meaning land that has never, ever been subjected to industrial logging, those pristine areas held 72% more carbon per hectare than the managed areas.
See, I can hear a forestry executive arguing with this right now.
Oh, they definitely do.
They would say, I look at a managed plantation and it is packed with trees. The density of wood is incredibly high. Where is this 83% difference coming from?
The difference is buried underground.
It's in the dirt.
It is. The true revelation from the Swedish study is the geographical location of the carbon. The researchers discovered that 64% of the ecosystem's carbon in these old-growth boreal forests is locked in the top meter of the soil.
64%. So over half of the climate value of the forest isn't in the wood at all?
Not at all. It's beneath your feet.
What exactly is in that top meter of dirt? I mean, it's not just dead leaves, right?
No, it is a staggering complex of biological architecture. You have a dense, interconnected web of root systems, for starters.
Right, holding it all together.
And then you have symbiotic fungal networks, known as mycorrhiza.
Oh, I've heard of these. The wood wide web.
Exactly. These fungal threads weave through the soil, trading nutrients with the trees and locking away carbon in their own cellular structures.
That's incredible.
And on top of that, you have generations upon generations of decaying organic matter, needles, fallen branches, animal remains, stuff that is slowly broken down in cool temperatures over millennia.
Forming that deep, rich soil.
Right, forming a deep, carbon-dense organic horizon.
And what happens to that soil architecture in a managed forest, like when they come in to log it?
Well, managed forest operates on a rotation cycle of perhaps 60 to 80 years.
So they clear it out every few decades.
Yeah, which means it never gets the chance to build that deep soil horizon. Every time the land is clear-cut, the canopy is completely removed.
So the shade is just gone.
The soil is suddenly exposed to direct, intense sunlight and warmer temperatures. Heavy machinery churns up the earth, destroying those fragile fungal networks we just talked about.
Oh man, the machinery just crushes it.
It does. And then the soil begins to rapidly oxidize. The organic matter breaks down at an accelerated rate, releasing its stored carbon back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide.
The Lund researchers actually quantified the cost of this disruption, which is wild.
The numbers are sobering.
They calculated that if managed forests were simply left alone, just allowed to age and restore their soil carbon density to match the old growth baseline, it could prevent 8 billion tons of CO2 emissions.
8 billion tons.
Just by deciding not to disturb the dirt.
This completely rewrites the ledger of forest value. But we can look beyond the freezing boreal forests of Sweden, too.
Yeah, let's bring it closer to home. Let's ground this discussion in the Canadian context.
Specifically, the wet coastal environments of British Columbia, like the highly contested Fairy Creek area on Vancouver Island.
Right. Because the Swedish forests are impressive, but the coastal temperate rainforests of BC, they operate on an entirely different magnitude of carbon density.
They're in a league of their own.
The numbers coming out of the Pacific Northwest are almost difficult to process. The research indicates that British Columbia's old coastal forests can store up to 1,300 megagrams of carbon per hectare.
And just for context, a megagram is a metric ton.
Okay, so we are looking at 1,300 tons of carbon packed into a patch of land the size of an athletic field.
To place that in a global hierarchy, those BC coastal rainforests are second in the world only to the multi-layered Australian temperate moist mountain ash forests.
Wow, okay. How much do the Australian ones hold?
They can achieve a staggering 2,800 megagrams per hectare.
Good lord. But still, the BC old growth is massive.
Oh, it dwarfs the carbon density of the Amazon rainforest. It holds far more carbon per hectare than tropical jungles.
Why is that specific coastal geography so efficient at hoarding carbon? I mean, what's the secret sauce?
The climate is the determining factor here. The research points out that highly productive coastal old forests in BC store up to 6 times more carbon than old forests in the drier inland areas of the exact same province.
Just because it's wetter?
Exactly. The constant moisture of the coastal rainforest acts as a biological shield. It prevents what ecologists call stand-replacing wildfires.
Okay, what does stand replacing mean in this context?
A stand-replacing fire is an inferno so hot and so intense that it kills the mature canopy trees. It effectively resets the ecosystem's clock all the way back to zero.
Like it just vaporizes everything.
Right. But because the coastal rainforest is saturated with moisture, these massive fires are incredibly rare.
So it just keeps growing?
Yeah. This allows the ecosystem to accumulate carbon undisturbed for thousands of years.
But trees do die eventually, right? What happens then?
When a giant tree finally does die of old age, it doesn't burn. It falls to the forest floor and becomes what's called a nurse log.
A nurse log. I love that term.
It's very descriptive. Because the environment is so wet and cool, that log might take centuries to fully decompose. It acts like a giant sodden sponge on the forest floor, slowly releasing nutrients to new saplings while stubbornly holding on to the vast majority of its carbon.
So the biological consensus is overwhelming. We have giant, ancient structures layered with thick moss, resting on top of complex, deep soil networks, functioning as literally the most efficient carbon vaults on the planet.
That's the biological reality.
Which forces a terrifying question. If the science universally agrees that undisturbed old-growth ecosystems are our best defense against atmospheric carbon, how do governments legally and logically justify cutting them down as part of a climate mitigation strategy?
And they really do argue that.
Because I am looking at government documents in our stack that do exactly that. They argue that logging is a green strategy. Are they just blindly ignoring the soil and the giant trees?
They are not ignoring the carbon, but they are filtering the forest through a highly specialized, deeply flawed mathematical machine.
Okay, tell me about this machine.
To understand this, we have to pull apart the thesis by Young-Kun Yan at the University of British Columbia.
Right, this was the advanced modeling paper.
Exactly. This research takes us under the hood of the specific computer models used by the BC government to dictate logging policy.
The ones with the intensely bureaucratic names.
You mean the Strategic Forest Management Model, or SFMM?
Yes, that one. And the Forest Carbon Budget Model, the FCBM.
Those are the ones.
I want to visualize what these models actually do. Because when we talk about a forest management model, I picture like a massive, incredibly complex spreadsheet algorithm. How do these tools actually function in the real world of policy?
You can think of these models as the central nervous system of a government forestry department.
Okay.
They digest millions of data points to tree species, growth rates, topography, economic demand, to generate a critical metric called the annual allowable cut.
The annual allowable cut, so the quota.
Right, this is the legal limit on how much timber companies are permitted to extract each year. But as with any algorithm, a model is entirely captive to the assumptions programmed into its core logic.
Garbage in, garbage out, or at least bias in, bias out.
Exactly. And the foundational assumption hardwired into these provincial models is the absolute prioritization of the flow of carbon over the total stock of carbon.
Flow versus stock. This is the teenager versus the bodybuilder analogy again, isn't it? But translated into government code.
You hit the nail on the head. The optimization algorithms are programmed to seek maximum efficiency of movement.
They want velocity.
Right. They're looking for environments where carbon is moving out of the atmosphere and into solid wood at the highest possible velocity.
So they see the teenager and think, wow, look at him go.
Exactly. As we discussed, a 400-year-old cedar is putting on massive volume, but its percentage growth rate relative to its total size is quite low.
While the 20-year-old pine sapling is tiny, but its percentage growth rate is incredibly high.
So the mathematical model looks at the old growth stand, sees the slow percentage rate, observes that some older trees are naturally dying and decaying, and mathematically categorizes the entire ancient forest as stagnant.
Stagnant. And the documents actually use the term decadent too, don't they?
They do.
The government models label ancient rainforests as decadent. It paints a picture of these ancient ecosystems lounging around, contributing nothing to society, just waiting to be liquidated.
The terminology is incredibly loaded, and it serves a very specific policy function.
It's PR for logging.
Basically. By defining older stands as stagnant or as net declining carbon sources, the mathematical models provide a highly technical, seemingly objective rationale for destroying them.
It makes it look like science.
Right. The logic of the algorithm dictates that you should cut down the decadent old forest, capture the wood, and replace it with a hyper-productive, fast-growing plantation.
Wow. So the model successfully frames the liquidation of primary old growth and its conversion into a managed tree farm as an active climate benefit.
That's how the math is written. But the UBC thesis tears this logic apart using a specific mathematical approach.
Yeah, the paper references something called the epsilon constraint method. For a listener who, doesn't have a graduate degree in statistical modeling, which includes me, what is the epsilon constraint method, and how does it expose the flaw in the government's algorithm?
So, the epsilon constraint method is a tool used in operations research to evaluate trade-offs in multi-objective optimization problems.
Okay, multi-objective optimization. Give me an analogy.
Imagine you are engineering a car and you have two competing goals. You want to maximize the top speed, but you also want to maximize the fuel efficiency.
Right, a sports car versus a Prius. You cannot perfectly achieve both.
Exactly. The epsilon constraint method allows you to mathematically freeze one goal, say, setting a hard constraint that the car absolutely must get 40 miles to the gallon, and then seeing how fast the car can possibly go under that strict condition.
Okay, have fun.
By moving that constraint slightly, again and again, you generate a visual graph.
And the research generated these graphs, which they call Pareto front curves.
Yeah.
What do these curves look like when you apply them to a forest instead of a car?
In the forestry context, the two competing goals are maximizing the economic timber yield and maximizing the total forest carbon storage.
The lumber versus the climate.
Right. When the researchers ran the data through the epsilon constraint method, the Pareto front curves revealed a stark, hostile, inverse relationship.
They fight each other.
They completely fight each other. The curve proved mathematically that maximizing the wood supply, which is the fundamental mandate of the forestry industry, directly and unavoidably contradicts maximizing the forest's climate benefit.
It's a zero-sum game.
Pretty much. The harder you push the system to hit economic sustained yield targets, the more severely you deplete the carbon vault.
So the government models are effectively rigged. They are designed to guarantee timber extraction under the guise of climate action by intentionally valuing the velocity of young growth over the sheer mass of carbon kept safely out of the atmosphere.
Rigged is a strong word, but they are definitely biased towards extraction.
But the models don't just rely on valuing young trees. There is a massive accounting loophole they use regarding how they track carbon after the tree is cut down.
Oh, this is a huge part of the problem.
It involves the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, right? The IPCC.
This is a vital piece of the puzzle. To comply with international reporting standards, national carbon inventories must differentiate between human-caused impacts and natural occurrences.
Which makes sense. Canada tracks human interventions like commercial logging separately from natural disturbances like lightning-caused wildfires or mountain pine beetle outbreaks.
On its face, that seems completely logical. You want to measure the impact of human industry separately from the baseline actions of nature.
Right. But where does the logic break down?
The logic fractures when you look at how the accounting actually handled the harvested wood. The models use default values and half-life assumptions provided by the IPCC for harvested wood products.
Harvested wood products, meaning lumber, paper, stuff like that.
Right. The mathematical model assumes that when a logging company clear-cuts an old-growth stand and turns the timber into 2x4s, that carbon is safely locked away in the structural framing of suburban houses for decades.
And it only slowly decays over a long half-life.
Exactly.
Meanwhile, how does the model treat the forest if it isn't logged?
This is where it gets crazy. The model looks at a standing forest, calculates the statistical probability of a future pine beetle outbreak or a severe drought, and concludes that nature is likely going to destroy the forest and release the carbon anyway.
Are you serious?
I am. So the policy takeaway becomes, we might as well log it immediately, convert it into human products, and claim we saved the carbon from a natural disaster.
That is an unbelievable accounting trick. The industry gets to claim that aggressive harvesting is actually a carbon rescue mission.
A preemptive strike against nature, basically.
But that assumption hinges entirely on the idea that the logging process is clean and that the vast majority of the carbon ends up safely inside a house.
Which is absolutely not what happens.
Right. We need to leave the spreadsheets and look at the physical reality of the cut block. What actually happens to the carbon on the ground when the chainsaws arrive?
The physical reality violently contradicts the mathematical model. Commercial logging is not some surgical extraction.
It's not just plucking a tree out with a crane.
Not at all. The hidden emissions generated by the act of logging are staggering. The data from environmental assessments, including reports from the Natural Resources Defense Council, shows that when an old-growth forest is logged, an estimated 40% to 65% of the ecosystem's total carbon is released into the atmosphere almost immediately.
Wait, hold on. 40 to 65%.
Or within a very short time frame following the harvest, yes.
If I am a builder and I buy a load of lumber from that forest to build a house, the carbon is in the wood in my hands. Where is the other 65% going? How is it escaping into the atmosphere so quickly?
You have to consider the anatomy of the entire forest, not just the lumber at the hardware store. The commercial timber industry is highly selective.
They want the good stuff.
Right. They only want the straightest, most solid, defect-free portions of the tree trunk. Everything else is collateral damage.
Like what?
The massive canopy branches, the irregular tops of the trees, the thick bark, the deep roots, the deformed trees, the non-commercial species that were in the way, all of that is severed and left behind on the ground.
Just left there.
The industry calls this slash.
And what happens to the slash? It doesn't just evaporate.
Well, in many jurisdictions, including British Columbia, the slash is bulldozed into massive piles.
Okay.
And to prepare the site for replanting the new crop of trees, the logging companies routinely set these slash piles on fire in the open air.
They just burn it.
Yeah, this practice is known as broadcast burning or slash burning. It creates an immediate catastrophic pulse of carbon dioxide straight into the atmosphere.
So the carbon that took a cedar tree 400 years to pull from the air is returned in a single afternoon.
Literally up in smoke.
And that is just the wood. What about the dirt? We established earlier that 64% of the carbon might be in the soil.
The soil is devastated. The heavy skidders and feller bunchers used in modern logging severely compact the earth, crushing the porous structures that hold water and air.
Right, the fungal networks.
Dead. The protective shade of the canopy is gone, exposing those delicate, moisture-dependent networks to baking solar radiation. The underground ecosystem dies, and as the organic matter rots in the sun, the soil rapidly oxidizes, steadily off-gassing carbon dioxide for years.
This creates an incredibly grim ecological paradox. The models champion the young, newly planted saplings as these aggressive carbon scrubbers.
Right, the ravenous teenagers.
But if the soil is bleeding carbon and the leftover stumps are rotting, what is the actual net carbon balance of a young plantation?
For the first several decades after an old-growth forest is clear-cut and replanted, that young, vibrant plantation is mathematically a net emitter of CO2.
A net emitter, it's making things worse.
Yes. The young saplings are indeed photosynthesizing rapidly, but their tiny bodies cannot possibly absorb carbon fast enough to offset the massive rate of decomposition happening all around them.
Because there's so much death around them.
Exactly. The rotting roots, the oxidizing soil, and the decaying woody debris are releasing greenhouse gases vastly faster than the new crop can capture them.
This brings us to a concept in the research that genuinely kept me up at night.
The debt.
The carbon debt. If we destroy a massive carbon vault, release half of it into the atmosphere immediately, and then plant a tiny sapling that takes decades just to stop the bleeding, we are essentially taking out a massive, high-interest carbon debt.
Carbon debt is the precise terminology used in the field, and the timeline of that debt is the most critical issue in this entire deep dive.
Let's talk about the timeline.
We have a terrifying timeline mismatch between the biological clock of the forest and the atmospheric clock of climate change.
Okay, let's look at the atmospheric clock first. The global consensus, driven by the IPCC, dictates that humanity has roughly 2 to 3 decades to drastically reduce emissions if we want to avoid crossing the 1.5 to 2.0 degrees Celsius warming threshold.
We need aggressive, immediate mitigation today.
Right. Now look at the biological clock. The research models calculate that if you log a 300-year-old stand today and plant a new one, the new stand will not recover the original carbon density for 200 years or more.
It takes 2 centuries just to break even.
2 centuries just to pay off the initial carbon debt created by the harvest?
We are creating massive, guaranteed carbon emissions today, right in the middle of a climate emergency, for a theoretical payoff in the year 2226.
It is the equivalent of a homeowner taking out a high-interest payday loan to buy a 200-year savings bond on the exact same day the bank is arriving to foreclose on the house.
That is a brutally accurate analogy.
The atmosphere doesn't care about the government's long-term spreadsheet projections. It only responds to the physical greenhouse gases trapping heat today.
Which is why the industry's attempt to find alternate uses for the waste wood is so heavily scrutinized in our sources.
Because they know the slash burning looks bad.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If building houses doesn't lock up enough carbon, the forestry sector has pivoted to another deeply controversial solution: bioenergy.
I want to examine bioenergy carefully because the industry messaging around it is very persuasive.
It sounds incredibly green.
The pitch is that bioenergy replaces fossil fuels. The process involves taking sawmill residue, the logging slash we just talked about, and sometimes entire whole trees, and running them through industrial chippers to process them into highly compressed wood pellets.
Little wooden pills, basically.
Right. These pellets are then loaded onto ships, largely exported to places like the United Kingdom or Asia, and burned in massive power plants to generate electricity.
Under current international accounting rules, burning forest biomass for electricity is frequently classified as a carbon-neutral energy source.
Carbon neutral. How do they justify that?
The policy justification argues that because you can theoretically plant a new tree to replace the one you burned,
Okay.
the cycle is closed. The emissions at the smokestack are legally ignored.
Legally ignored. But the scientific assessments in our source material absolutely tear this premise apart. They argue it is not carbon neutral at all. Why does the science contradict the international accounting?
It comes down to basic chemistry and thermal efficiency. Wood is fundamentally less energy dense than coal.
Okay.
You have to burn a significantly larger physical volume of wood to generate the exact same amount of electricity as coal. Because you are burning more mass, the smokestack emissions of a biomass power plant immediately pump out more CO2 per kilowatt hour of energy produced than a traditional coal plant.
Wait, more than coal?
Yes.
So in the immediate term, in that critical 20 to 30-year window, we have to stop global warming. Replacing coal with wood pellets actually increases the amount of carbon entering the atmosphere.
Precisely. And the sources highlight severe economic distortions driving this practice too. The bioenergy sector in places like British Columbia does not operate on pure free market demand. It is heavily propped up by government subsidies.
Of course.
Organizations like the Forest Enhancement Society of BC have directed millions of taxpayer dollars to subsidize the physical transportation of low-value wood waste to pellet mills.
And there is a glaring regulatory loophole regarding taxation, isn't there?
Oh, the carbon tax issue, yes.
If a factory in British Columbia burns natural gas, they pay a provincial carbon tax on those emissions. But if a logging company piles up a mountain of slash on a clear cut and sets it on fire in the open air to prepare the site, No carbon tax is applied to those massive emissions.
None at all.
The authors of the reports argue this represents a massive, unaccounted-for climate subsidy to the logging industry.
Beyond the flawed carbon mathematics, the push for bioenergy inflicts severe collateral damage on the physical forest ecosystem.
Because they're taking everything.
Exactly. The industry drive to vacuum up all the waste wood from a forest floor completely deprives the landscape of the downed wood, the rotting logs, and the standing dead snags.
Which we established are crucial for the dirt.
These are not waste. They are critical infrastructure for biodiversity. They provide insect habitat, they feed the fungal networks, they build future soil, and they maintain the overall moisture resilience of the forest. When a pellet company strip mines the biomass from a site, they are permanently degrading the future fertility of the ecosystem.
The compounding failures of these models. I mean, the ignorance of the soil, the prioritization of growth rates over storage volume, the timeline mismatch of the carbon debt, the flawed logic of bioenergy. These are not just academic debates happening in university biology department.
No, this is playing out in real time.
This mathematical disconnect is causing real, intense friction between communities living near these forests and the policymakers attempting to manage them. We can see this battleground clearly when we look at specific regional decisions, like the recent Sunshine Coast Timber Supply Area review in British Columbia.
The Sunshine Coast story is a perfect microcosm of this conflict. A timber supply area, or TSA, is simply an administrative geographical boundary used by the government to manage logging quotas.
Okay.
Periodically, the province initiates a review to recalculate the annual allowable cut for that specific area. By law, they open this process to public consultation.
And the public response documented in the government files for the Sunshine Coast is fascinating. The local communities did not just complain. They came armed with the exact climate science we are discussing today.
They did their homework.
They demanded a fundamental change in the mathematical model. They formally requested that the government mandate longer logging rotations, asking to add an extra 20 years to the lifespan of managed trees before they could be legally cut, specifically to allow them to sequester more carbon.
A very reasonable request based on the data.
They demanded that ancient, old-growth forests be permanently removed from the timber harvesting land base, essentially asking the government to stop pretending these ancient carbon vaults were just future lumber. They explicitly wanted non-timber values, like biodiversity and climate change mitigation, prioritized over timber extraction.
The crucial pivot point in this story is the official written response from the government modeler.
The person actually running the spreadsheet.
Right. The modeler is the bureaucratic official responsible for actually running the software and setting the logging level. This is where we see the collision between biological science and institutional policy.
I read the modeler's rationale, and the cognitive dissonance is staggering.
It's hard to read.
The modeler did not deny the science. In the official document, they explicitly acknowledged the public's concern. They wrote that they noted the significant loss of ecosystem carbon from burning. They fully admitted that clear-cut logging produces real, immediate carbon emissions.
But acknowledging scientific reality and changing the parameters of a legal algorithm are two entirely different things.
Exactly. After admitting the process causes massive emissions, the modeler's final conclusion, and this is a direct quote from the decision document, stated, "I will not make any adjustment to the current practice base case harvest projection to account for forest carbon."
If the model says one thing, but the biological reality says another, why does the bureaucrat side with the model?
Because it's safer.
It is a function of institutional inertia. The modeler is operating within a rigid, legal, and economic framework that mandates a predictable, sustained flow of timber to feed the local mills.
So they literally can't change it.
The models they use are not currently designed, nor are they legally required, to optimize the landscape for climate change mitigation, if doing so disrupts the core economic objective of the timber supply. The machine is built to harvest wood, so it harvests wood, regardless of the atmospheric cost.
It is incredibly frustrating to see the science acknowledged and then immediately ignored because the spreadsheet doesn't have a column for it.
Very frustrating.
But this tension isn't limited to one region in British Columbia. This fight between conservation and extraction is happening on a national scale, which brings us to the expansive policy assessment by CPAWS.
Right, the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society.
CPAWS zoomed out to evaluate the entire country. Their report, titled On the Path to 2030, evaluates how the federal, provincial, and territorial governments in Canada are progressing toward their international commitments under the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework.
This is the famous 30 by 30 target.
Right. Canada, along with many other nations, has formally committed to protecting 30% of its land and oceans by the year 2030. CPAW decided to issue a report card grading the actual on-the-ground progress of these governments, looking past the political promises to measure concrete actions.
And the resulting grades offer a stark, highly contrasted map of political priorities across the nation.
Let's walk through this report card. At the top of the class, which might surprise some people, is the province of Quebec. They scored an A-. How did Quebec achieve the highest grade in the country?
Quebec earned the top spot through a combination of massive financial commitment and structural process reform.
Put their money where their mouth is.
Exactly. They committed $650 million specifically to conservation efforts. But more importantly, they completely overhauled how protected areas are created.
How so?
Instead of top-down government mandates, they developed innovative processes that actively empower Indigenous groups and local public communities to identify, propose, and designate protected areas. They democratized the conservation process, allowing the people who live on the land to shield it from extraction.
Moving west, British Columbia scored a solid B. They earned points for making bold conceptual commitments, but the real driver of their grade was the establishment of a tripartite framework agreement on nature conservation.
Right, a very big deal for BC.
This is a massive structural agreement bringing together the federal government, the provincial government, and First Nations, backed by $563 million, specifically earmarked to support Indigenous-led protected areas.
The federal government itself earned a B+. They have successfully advanced several massive new national parks and marine protected areas, and their financial support for Indigenous-led initiatives has been robust.
But there's a catch, isn't there?
There is. The CPAW searchers flagged a massive, looming systemic risk for the federal government.
What is the risk? If they are spending the money, what is the problem?
The problem is the timeline of the funding. The progress has been largely driven by a specific financial program called the Enhanced Nature Legacy Initiative. That funding is strictly scheduled to expire in 2026.
Oh, so it's a cliff.
A huge cliff. If the federal government does not commit to long-term permanent funding past that date, all of the momentum they have built could stall entirely. You cannot protect complex ecosystems on a temporary budget cycle.
And then we drop to the bottom of the class, the laggards of the nation. Provinces like Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario receive dismal grades ranging from D- to F.
The CPAW analysis is unsparing regarding these jurisdictions.
I mean, an F is pretty bad.
The report highlights that these provincial governments are actively, systematically prioritizing resource extraction, industrial development, and environmental deregulation over the protection of ecosystems. By clinging to the old models of endless extraction, they are actively missing the critical window necessary to establish the protections required to meet the 2030 international targets.
So if you are listening to this, you might be wondering why you should care about the nuances of the forest carbon budget model or the grading criteria of a CPAW's report card.
It can feel abstract.
Why does the bureaucratic infighting over a timber supply area matter to your daily life?
It matters deeply because your tax dollars are currently subsidizing the very systems that are exacerbating the climate crisis.
You're paying for the slash burning.
Exactly. The stability of your local environment is directly tied to which mathematical model our governments choose to obey. When a model justifies the clear cutting of an ancient forest, it doesn't just release carbon, it removes the natural infrastructure that filters your local drinking water, and it creates dry, debris-filled landscapes that severely fuel the intensity of summer wildfires.
The future climate stability of the entire planet relies on preserving these massive natural carbon gulls.
It really does.
If the old model, this deeply flawed idea that we must violently cut down the forest to save the climate, is scientifically bankrupt, what is the actual evidence-based solution? If planting tiny saplings doesn't fix the immediate math, what does?
The research points clearly toward an emerging solution that requires a radical, fundamental shift in how we value the forest. And the sources introduce a specific concept that is becoming central to this new paradigm.
We all know the word reforestation, the act of planting new trees after an area is industrially cleared. We know deforestation, the permanent removal of the forest. But the research focuses on a third term, proforestation.
Proforestation is arguably the most effective, immediate, and economically efficient climate strategy available to us in the forestry sector.
What does it actually mean?
Proforestation describes the deliberate policy of allowing existing, mature forests to simply continue growing without any human interference or commercial extraction.
It is the radical act of walking away and leaving the forest alone.
Sounds too simple, doesn't it?
It does, but I have to ask, from a biological standpoint, how does a mature forest continue to grow if it is already full of giant trees? Doesn't it eventually run out of space and stop absorbing carbon?
That assumes the forest is a static block of wood, but it is a dynamic, constantly shifting ecosystem driven by what ecologists call gap dynamics and natural succession.
Gap dynamics. Okay, paint a picture for me.
In a truly ancient forest, an individual giant tree will eventually die of old age, disease, or a lightning strike. When that massive structure finally crashes to the ground, it tears a hole in the thick canopy. Suddenly, a shaft of intense sunlight hits the dark forest floor.
It creates a gap.
Precisely. That gap triggers an explosive race among the understory plants and dormant saplings to fill the void. New growth surges upward, rapidly sequestering carbon.
While the old tree.
Meanwhile, the giant fallen tree becomes a nurse log, slowly rotting over centuries, feeding the soil and holding on to its massive carbon stock. The forest is constantly dying and being reborn on a microscale, endlessly accumulating deep soil carbon without ever losing its overall macro-level density.
Proforestation simply means legally protecting that incredibly efficient natural cycle.
Right.
But implementing proforestation forces us to confront the massive economic elephant in the room.
Which is the industry.
The commercial timber industry employs tens of thousands of people. Entire regional economies, countless small towns rely almost exclusively on the revenue generated by logging these forests. You cannot just walk into a logging community, tell them, we are leaving the trees alone now, and expect them to survive the economic shock.
You absolutely cannot. And the experts authoring these reports emphasize that protecting the carbon requires shifting our entire economic framework regarding how a forest generates value.
We have to pay for the carbon.
For over a century, the industry has relied on an economic model that researchers characterize as a feast on big trees. They have systematically targeted and harvested the easiest, largest, most commercially valuable timber. But that era of cheap, massive timber is rapidly approaching a terminal end. The easily accessible primary forests are dwindling.
So we have to redefine the commodity. Instead of valuing a tree only when it is severed from the stump and loaded onto a logging truck, we need to economically value the service of carbon storage.
This brings us to the mechanism of conservation financing. If an intact old-growth forest is providing a multi-billion-dollar service to the global climate by keeping millions of tons of carbon safely out of the atmosphere, then the local communities that steward and protect those forests must be financially compensated for providing that service.
And the research points to actual functioning models of this happening right now, specifically through indigenous-led conservation initiatives. The sources highly commend a framework called Project Finance for Permanence, or the PFP model.
They're currently being deployed in places like the Northwest Territories.
How does a PFP actually replace timber revenue on the ground?
The PFP model is a revolutionary financial structure. It brings together massive capital from national governments, private global philanthropy, and indigenous nations to secure long-term, massive-scale, permanent funding for conservation before the protected area is even finalized. It is not a temporary grant.
So they build an unshakable financial war chest first.
Exactly. This allows First Nations to establish massive protected areas that permanently safeguard biodiversity and carbon vaults. But crucially, the PFP funding generates direct local economic benefits.
So it replaces the logging jobs.
It creates high-paying jobs in environmental stewardship, scientific monitoring, ecotourism, and infrastructure management. It supports cultural revitalization programs. It proves definitively that local communities do not have to make a false choice between a thriving, robust economy and resource extraction. Conservation itself becomes the primary economic engine of the region.
It is a total paradigm shift. It moves us from an economy of extraction to an economy of stewardship.
That's the goal.
Let's synthesize the massive journey we have been on today. We started by looking at the ravenous teenager and the ancient bodybuilder. If we step back from the spreadsheets and the policy fights, what are the core truths we need to take away from this research?
First, we must recognize that old-growth forests are utterly irreplaceable carbon vaults. The biological reality is undeniable. Ancient trees and their massive, undisturbed, fungus-rich soil networks hold vastly more carbon than managed plantations, and they continue to accumulate that mass for centuries.
Second, Our mathematical models have betrayed reality. The optimization tools our governments use to dictate policy have dangerously and systematically prioritized the short-term rate of growth over the long-term reality of sheer carbon mass. They have created a false, dangerous narrative that liquidating old growth is somehow a benefit to the climate.
Third, the mathematics of the carbon debt are inescapable. Cutting down primary forests creates catastrophic, immediate greenhouse gas emissions. You cannot recover a 300-year-old carbon debt in the short, two-decade window we have left to address the climate crisis. And pushing the industry toward bioenergy-burning forest biomass for electricity frequently exacerbates the immediate climate problem while strip mining the future fertility of the forest.
And finally, the path forward requires a radical economic shift. Proforestation, the act of leaving ancient ecosystems alone, supported by massive conservation financing like the PFP models that empower indigenous-led stewardship, is arguably the most immediate, effective, and necessary climate action we can take as a society.
The scientific debate regarding the biological value of these forests is effectively over. The challenge we face now is entirely one of challenging institutional inertia, reshaping economics, and generating political will.
It's fundamentally about changing how we measure value in the world, which leaves me with a final thought I want you, the listener, to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive. Throughout this entire hour, we have unpacked how our massive, heavily funded forestry systems have systematically undervalued age. We have completely undervalued complexity.
We really have.
We have willfully ignored the slow, invisible, centuries-long accumulation of immense value in the soil and the trunks of these ancient forests simply because it didn't fit neatly into an optimization spreadsheet. We were totally distracted by the visual illusion of fast, manageable, easily quantifiable growth.
Because it's easier to count.
Right. If humanity made that massive, catastrophic miscalculation when looking at the natural world, where else in our society and our economic structures, or even in our own personal lives, are we making that exact same mistake? What other complex old-growth systems, our local communities, our democratic institutions, our deepest relationships, are we carelessly tearing down, thinking we can easily and quickly replant them, only to realize too late the massive, irreplaceable depth of what we've lost?
That's a powerful question to leave on.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. The next time you walk past a massive old tree in your neighborhood or hike through a patch of woods, look at it with a totally new perspective. Look past the green leaves, look down at the dirt beneath your feet, and try to see the invisible, ancient warehouse of carbon quietly standing guard. We'll see you next time.
Heliox is produced by Michelle Brucker and Scott Bleakley. It features reviews of emerging research and ideas from leading thinkers, curated under their creative direction with AI assistance for voice, imagery, and composition. Systemic voices and illustrative images of people are representative tools, not depictions of specific individuals. Thanks for listening today. 4 recurring narratives underlie every episode: boundary dissolution, adaptive complexity, embodied knowledge, and quantum-like uncertainty. These aren't just philosophical musings, but frameworks for understanding our modern world. We hope you continue exploring our other episodes, responding to the content, and checking out our related articles at helioxpodcast.substack.com.